Hello and welcome to my world. Today I'm going to be showing you my ESP Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger Clod Buster truck that you see here. And before I get into the details about the truck, let me give you a little bit about my history with this particular truck and how I got started in radio-controlled monster trucks. My very first RC monster truck was a Tamiya Blackfoot that I got in about 1986, and I loved monster trucks, the full-scale ones, so I decided, why don't I get into RC monster trucks? I previously had a few RC buggies, but I really wanted to get into monster trucks, so the Blackfoot was the truck that I started on my long journey with. And although it was a fun truck, it was only two-wheel drive, so it didn't really do what I wanted to do, which was all sorts of car crushing and stump pulling and all that kind of stuff that you saw early monster trucks doing in the mid-1980s. So as soon as the Clod Buster came out in 1987, I quickly sold my Blackfoot and I put all that money towards a brand new, at that time, the Clod Buster had just come out, so I put all my money into the brand new, latest and greatest Tamiya kit, the Tamiya Clod Buster in 1987. And that truck, through the years, slowly morphed into what you see here. And this truck has gone through many changes through the years, but this is my favorite version of the truck as it currently stands. And on top, let me start at the beginning, on top is a Parma Gravedigger body that, as you'll notice, I severely hacked up. I completely went crazy on this with a pair of Lexan scissors and shaved off everything that interfered with the tires during full suspension compression. And you can see there's really not much left of it, unfortunately. One of the things that has absolutely driven me nuts about this truck through the years is that the iconic Gravedigger red headlights are long gone. So I had to cut out the fenders and cut some more, flex the suspension, and then cut some more, and what I was left with is what you see here, which is really not much of the body shell, aside from just the Parma decals on a black, somewhat 1950 Chevrolet panel truck body. So there's really not too much left of the body, so let me just take that off and show you some of the nitty-gritty details of what makes this truck tick. This truck is built around an ESP Clodzilla 4 chassis kit, and at the time that I bought it, we're talking about the late 1990s, there were basically only two aftermarket Clod Buster kits, suspension kits and chassis kits that were available at the time. One was the Bennett Equipment Clod Lever chassis, and the other one was the then brand new ESP Clodzilla 4. And I debated quite a bit before deciding to go with the ESP one, because the Bennett Clod Lever, while it had won numerous NRC TPA championships and everybody raved about it, it was basically impossible to buy back in those days. You placed your order with Bennett Equipment and you waited and you waited and waited some more. Sometimes it took months and months for people to actually get their Bennett Clod Lever kits delivered to them. So I did not want to go through that hassle, so I went with the more easily available ESP Clodzilla 4, which at that time actually ESP products were sold by Tower Hobbies, and that's where I bought my Clodzilla 4 kit from. And after placing my order, I had it delivered. It arrived at my door in about a week. So I figured, sure, the ESP kit may not perform as well in the World Championships compared to the Bennett Equipment Clod Lever, but that's okay. I'm not going to race my truck. I'm not a competitive driver by any stretch of the imagination, so I could live with that, and I was just very happy that I got my kit as perfectly delivered when they said it would come. It only took about a week, so everything went fine with that. And I have no regrets about my purchase. So let me kind of get a little closer here so you can see some of the details. Some people don't really know much about the ESP Clodzilla 4 nowadays, because I guess ESP has been out of business for quite a few years now. But the Clodzilla 4 is a cantilever 4-link suspension system on this kit, as you can see here, consisting of the 4 cantilevers. All 4 are ball bearing supported. And through the years, I've made some modifications to the standard ESP Clodzilla 4 kit, and I'll get into those as this video goes on. But the 4 shock absorbers that I used on my kit are Team Low C shocks, and these are the long rear shocks that were used on the Double XT stadium truck. And this truck has a high-tech shredder receiver and a Novak Super Rooster speed controller. Both of those have been working great on this truck for so long now. I see no reason to change them. They work perfectly fine. And some of the changes I made to this truck. If you notice, one of the reasons the body sits so low is because I have ESP aluminum body mount posts on this truck, and on the front and on the rear. And these posts were specifically made by ESP to mount a Parma Gravedigger body onto a stock Clod Buster chassis. Well, the stock Clod Buster chassis with its stock suspension doesn't have much wheel travel, so there's no danger of the tires bumping in or hitting the body. But since the Clodzilla kit has so much more wheel travel compared to a stock Clod Buster, that's why I had to basically hack up the Parma body like crazy. Now, I could have used some generic plastic body mount posts, sure, but I wanted to keep the aluminum ones because they look cool, and I had an obsession with machined aluminum parts at that time. One of the disadvantages of using such long body posts, though, in addition to having to hack up the Gravedigger body, is that they provide, or they create a tremendous amount of stress on the chassis when the truck rolls over, because they don't flex. They're really stiff, unlike common plastic body mount posts. So one time when I jumped my truck, it flipped over backwards and landed on one of these rear body mount posts, and one of them actually bent the top surface of one of the frame rails back here just a tiny bit. Didn't break the vertical surfaces of the frame rails, just the top surface, just a little teeny tiny bit. So in order to prevent that from happening, I first of all straightened out the frame rail, and then I built these chassis braces right here from aluminum stock that I bought just from the local hardware store. So there's one in front here, and there's one in the rear right here. And those are made from aluminum L-channel that I machined one of the walls of it down right here. So I just machined that down. At that time I had access to an end mill, and I just machined them both down. That side, and then also this one right here, same thing. Just machine that surface down, and so that they fit nicely onto the frame rails. So that's one of the modifications I made. Another modification I made to the Clodzilla kit is that underneath it I made a chassis brace right here, flat, out of just aluminum, this aluminum stock that I once again bought at the local hardware store. And that came about because there was one time when I jumped the truck again and I nosedived it, just did a lawn dart, stuffed it into the ground, and that caused the center of the ESP Clodzilla 4 chassis to bend right here where the suspension links are mounted. And the Clodzilla 4, this bottom portion right here of the chassis where the aluminum links mount onto, that bottom portion right there is just the standard ESP chassis brace that they sold, that was designed to be used on the stock Clod Buster plastic chassis tub. And it's not the thickest piece of aluminum in the world, to say the least, so that's why my chassis, my original chassis, bent right there originally. So I happen to have an extra one of these chassis braces just sitting in my spare parts box that I had used way back when my Clod Buster had the original plastic chassis tub. So just put that back on here, got rid of the bent original one, and I made this piece here from just some aluminum stock and just drilled 4 holes in it, cut it to the length, drilled 4 holes in it, and mounted it to the underside of the chassis to prevent that part from bending again. And I've never had a problem with that ever again. Along those same lines, I never bent this portion, but where these links are mounted, never bent the chassis there, but to prevent it from happening, I once again went to the good old local hobby shop, or excuse me, local hardware store, and bought some more aluminum stock, and I mounted it back there, just some aluminum bar, cut it to about 2 inches long, drilled a couple holes in it, and just mounted it right there on the inside of the chassis. And I basically was kind of copying what Tamiya later did with the chassis braces that come with the bullhead, except the bullhead's chassis braces are made out of steel, but I kind of just copied those, made them out of aluminum, and stuck them in there. So I've never had any problems with those, that center portion of the chassis bending right there where those suspension links are mounted, but just to avoid it, I decided to make some chassis braces for that. And the last modification that I made to my Clodzilla 4 is I added extra cantilevers here. And if you notice, my cantilevers are 2 triangular pieces of aluminum bolted together. The original ESP configuration for the suspension only has 1 piece of aluminum here for each cantilever, and it only has 1 ball bearing there. And with a lot of use on my truck and a lot of jumping, I noticed that with time, the ball bearings in one of the cantilevers started getting really worn out, to the point where the tip of the cantilever actually rubbed on the frame rail right here. So at the time, for a very short time, ESP sold a kit where it consisted of just the suspension cantilevers with extra bearings. And so what that did was it enabled you to install an extra bearing at each pivot point. So my chassis actually has 2 cantilevers and 2 ball bearings at each corner. And with the dual ball bearings in there, there's absolutely no play in the suspension system at all. And I've never had any problems with the bearings wearing out ever again. And it's unfortunately, ESP did not include that with the original kit. It was kind of like an add-on afterwards. And I'm so glad that I did that, because I've never had any problems with any of the ball bearings wearing out ever since I made that upgrade. One of the other things that I did to this truck, not really an aftermarket modification, but just something I did to prevent these links right here from rubbing on the sway bar, and to kind of space out the links a little bit, and also to secure the links to the center of the chassis here better, is I added an extra conical washer right here. So instead of having just 1 conical washer like ESP tells you to do in the instructions, I actually have 2 at each location here in the center of the chassis. And what I did was I took the conical washer, one of the conical washers, and I put its smaller end in the hole here in the frame. And that is because, as I said, this center portion of the chassis was originally a chassis brace, and the chassis brace on the stock Clod Buster has holes drilled in it for 4mm screws, and those are for the big ball joints that the stock Clod Buster suspension arms attach to, and which works great for the stock suspension style. But when you have 4-link suspensions like what's on the Clodzilla 4, these are not 4mm screws here. These are 3mm screws. So you have a 3mm screw inside a 4mm hole, and so there's a lot of play in here. And this screw right here will slide around a lot. With the addition of the conical washer, it helps center this 3mm screw in the hole in the chassis. So at each pivot point here, I actually have 2 conical washers in there. And the conical washer with its pointed end goes into the 4mm hole in the chassis brace, or the center portion of the chassis there, and it helps us center it and prevents this screw and the end of this suspension link from moving around completely. Now I remember no matter how tight I could tighten this 3mm screw before, I just couldn't keep it centered in that 4mm hole back there. So ever since I put that extra conical washer in there though, it's never moved around once. And as an added benefit too, there's plenty of clearance now between the suspension link here and the anti-sway bar right there. So before it used to kind of slightly rub on there, and it actually made a little squeaking sound. It was very annoying. So that went away with the extra conical washer. So those are all the changes that I made to the original Clodzilla 4 chassis kit. And I'll now show some of the other modifications that this truck has. If you notice, it has GPS gear cases, axle tubes, and steering knuckles. And that was back in the day. I bought these back in the day when JPS was still in business. They were the original company that made aluminum aftermarket gear cases and axle tubes for Tamiya Clod Busters. I did not order these from JPS directly though. I actually bought these from way back in the day. I bought these from Stormer Hobbies. Stormer Hobbies used to sell JPS parts way back in the day. And while I'm here, you can notice the steering bell crank that I have on both ends of this truck. This is a 4-wheel steering truck. So this is a ESP steering bell crank on there. And I like that one because it's all aluminum and it rotates on ball bearings. Some of the bell cranks out there do not rotate on ball bearings, so as a result they wear out and become very sloppy. Whereas these ones, I've never had that problem with them. And if they do, I can just replace the ball bearings pretty quickly and easily. Up front here and also on the back are ESP twin tube lower bumpers and ESP skid plates underneath. Those are just standard, at the time they were standard ESP parts. The wheels are JPS Deluxe Star wheels, and I use those because actually on the Clodzilla 4 box, the original shipping box had a picture of a Clodzilla 4 with these exact wheels on them, these Deluxe Stars, and I've always liked these ever since. Also, another benefit of these JPS wheels is that they have a more positive offset, so they widen the front and rear track of the truck, which increases its stability a little bit. Makes it a little harder to roll over in turns. The tires are good old Proline Giant tracks. Don't try looking for those at your local hobby shop. Although I did buy these off the shelf at the local hobby shop back in the day. These are still my favorite Clod Buster tires, aftermarket tires, because they are the same diameter as the stock Tamiya tires that they replace. One of my biggest pet peeves is that so many of the aftermarket Clod Buster tires are actually smaller in diameter than the stock Tamiya tires. And it's just me. Nobody else has this problem, but it's just me. Replacing stock tires with a smaller tire really goes against everything I believe in. So that's just me. I fully admit nobody else has that issue, but it's just me. That kind of gets under my skin. Why replace stock tires with smaller tires? Yeah, the diehard four-wheeler and off-roader in me just doesn't see eye to eye with that philosophy. Oh, one other change that I made to this Clodzilla 4 chassis that I forgot to mention is I also added associated RC10 battery cups in here. And the original mounting system for the battery that ESP gives you are just some holes in the chassis for some zip ties to mount secure the battery. I never liked that. It took forever to change the battery with those, so I went out and I bought some RC10 battery cups and I just bolted them down to the chassis, and they work really well. They allow you to change the battery really quickly. If you notice the wiring in here, also all the wiring is made by Dean's. It's Dean's wet noodle 12 gauge wire, and all the battery connectors and the motor connectors are Dean's Ultra plugs. And if you notice on most of my trucks, I have Dean's battery plugs used for the motor wires, and on Clod Busters I just find that so much easier for maintenance. If I want to do gear changes, gear ratio changes, or take out a gearbox or something like that, it's just so much easier to just have a simple plug here. I can unplug, pop the motor out real quick, as opposed to having to unsolder and resolder the battery terminals on the motor, the wires on the motors. That's such a pain. You have to get in there with the soldering iron in there. It's like, oh, forget it. So I've always just sworn by just using good old Dean's plugs on the motors, and they work so great and just so simple. The rear of the truck has the same JPS parts as the front, same ESP twin tube lower bumper, same skid plates as the front. But one thing that's a little bit different is the rear steering system. If you notice, on the front, the servo saver horn points upward, and on the rear, the servo saver horn points downward. And that's in order to ensure that the truck turns to the left and to the right when it's steering. I am controlling this just with a 2-channel radio, so I don't have fancy steering mixing, or it doesn't do crab steering or any of that fancy stuff. So in order to get the rear system to turn in the correct direction, I had to flip the servo saver 180 degrees. Those are Kimbrough servo savers, by the way. I had to flip it 180 degrees compared to the front. In order to prevent the servo saver from rubbing on top of the motor, I put a 1/4 inch thick piece of machined aluminum here between the servo and the ESP servo mount bracket right there. So it's just sandwiched in there, held down with servos, held down with a couple of zip ties and lots of servo tape. And while I'm on the subject of servos, those are Surus CS80 servos in there, both in the front and the rear. And those are the servos that are no longer being made, that have the famous clear case that you can see through. And the motors are Trinity Monster Horsepower Clod Buster motors, both front and rear. I don't know the exact specs for these motors. I bought these originally for my Clod Buster way back when it was almost stock. Back around, I guess I bought these around 1988 or 89. And Trinity used to sell match sets for motors for Clod Busters, front and rear. And I think they're 17-turn singles, but don't quote me on that. I don't remember. If anybody knows, please let me know. But I don't remember what the Monster Horsepower series of Clod Buster motors, what the specs on them were. The heat sinks on there, those big purple ones on the front and the rear, those were made by Trinity. Those are available back in the day. And one other thing I forgot to mention is that to mount the suspension links onto the JPS axle tubes, the JPS axle tubes are really small compared to the stock Clod Buster axle tubes in this area right here where the kingpins are. And I originally drilled some holes in mine, as you can see right here, to mount the suspension links on them. And that, I saw a few people doing that back in the day. In particular, there was an article in RC Car Action where the builder of the truck did that, but I just got terrible steering geometry when I did that. Or it's just, the caster would got all completely out of whack, especially when the suspension compressed. So it made my truck just unstable. It's just impossible to control. So later on, about a year or two later, ESP came out with these suspension link mounting brackets that actually clamp onto the axle tubes, the JPS aluminum axle tubes. So I bought a set of those and use them, and if you notice, they have tapped holes in them for the suspension links right here, and they work phenomenally well. They completely fixed all of the suspension geometry, all the caster problems I was having. It just eliminated all of that. One thing I'm not a big fan of though is that they only clamp onto the axle tubes here. So there's no mechanical locking system that connects them to these round tubes here. They just strictly are held in by friction. So theoretically it is possible that the entire gear case and the axles can rotate around these brackets because they're just clamped on there with force and just friction is all it's holding them. I've never had that happen, but theoretically it is possible for the gearbox, the entire gearbox, motor, axle tubes, the whole assembly it's theoretically possible for it to rotate, although like I said, I've never experienced that. So anyways, that is my ESP Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck, and I've had this truck for several decades now, and I absolutely love this truck. I don't think I will ever get rid of this Clod Buster. Although it's changed so much since 1987, I don't think it's a completely different truck, but I would never part with it. It's still, at its heart, it's still a Clod Buster. It still has the Clod Buster axles, axle shafts, and plastic gears inside the gear cases. So in a way, it's somewhat still a Clod Buster, but there's not much stock Clod Buster left in it, I admit. But those red bumper brackets, as you can see, yep, those are still the stock ones from 1987. So there we go. There's a little bit of stock Clod Buster still left in this thing. So anyways, that's my ESP Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to leave any questions or comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. So that's it for this one. I'll catch you in the next video.